Greetings from the set of Metro and More at Metropolitan Community College, serving more than 50,000 students with over 120 programs at our 8 locations in the daytime, evening, weekends, or online. I'm your host, Kent Pavelka. Welcome again to Metro and More. More of what you need to know about Metropolitan Community College. It is a treat to, in the next hour, visit with Dr. Joy Castro, author and educator, and a conversation with a prolific writer and a educator at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. Dr. Castro was a recent presenter at Metropolitan Community College during Hispanic Latino Heritage Month, and it is a treat to have you on the show.
Thank you so much.
Your appearance at Metro precedes our recording date.
Yeah.
But what was your what did you present when you were here?
I was talking about a book called Island of Bones that has to do with Latino heritage and the complexity of Latino heritage in the United States today.
The focus was on that.
Yes.
We've got a lot to talk about here, including that book. But maybe we can begin a little bit. You can tell us about yourself. You write.
Yes.
You teach.
Yes.
You have a family. Maybe begin with what your position is and what all you do at UNL.
Okay, I'm joint appointed in Ethnic Studies, which is an institute at UNL, and within Ethnic Studies I teach Latino studies, including Latino literature. And then the other half of my joint appointment is in English, and I teach creative writing at the graduate level and the undergraduate level, and then I also teach literature, 20th century, mostly American literature, but some British literature and Caribbean literature also.
That is that's a lot. A lot.
Yeah, yeah.
Are these things? Are all these things? They come together for you, or are they disparate in terms of? I mean, these aren't. You teach Latino heritage and writing. That's not necessarily something you'd think that would go together.
Well, they come together in me. It's always been my experience that, I've been a writer, I've been Latina, that's my whole life, and so I'm fortunate that the position at UNL allows me to work in those different areas, because to some people they would seem disparate, but to me it's just a product of the intersections that I've always lived in my experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's Dr. Castro. Tell us about your education. Where did you get your PhD? Or you're from Miami, I know that.
I was born in Miami. I grew up in Miami and in England and in West Virginia. And West Virginia is where I graduated from high school. And then I went to Texas when I was 16 for college.
Austin?
No, I went to Trinity University in San Antonio. Which was a great experience. I loved that. And then I stayed in Texas for my master's and PhD, which are both from Texas A&M University.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Been there many times.
Oh, uh-huh.
And then, so how did you wind up in Lincoln?
Well, after graduate school, I taught for 10 years at a small private liberal arts college in Indiana. It's one of the 3 remaining all-male colleges in the country. It's called Wabash College. Which was a really interesting place to teach like women's literature and feminist theory to all male classes. That was always interesting and a challenge. And then after I had been there for 10 years, UNL called and asked if I might be interested in ever moving to Nebraska. I had never been to Nebraska, so I said, sure, I'll come. I'll check it out, see what it's like. And I was really struck. Flying in, it was I think it was a November visit, and I flew into Lincoln, and the ground was just sort of brown and rolling, and it looked strangely beautiful. It was not a landscape that I'd ever seen, so I was instantly curious. And then I, landed and met all the faculty, and they were wonderful. The person who had recruited me is Amelia Montes, and she's also in both ethnic studies and English. And I met her and all the other faculty members and just kind of fell in love, and so I've been here since 2007.
2007, okay.
Yeah.
So you've been here a while.
Yeah.
I was going to say Indiana, Nebraska, they
No,
look different from an airplane?
You would think that they would be more similar, but they're not. They're really not. And also Nebraska has a lot more sunshine, more sunny days per year than Indiana. Although my husband was just telling me this week that Lincoln is the 7th coldest city in the United States, and Omaha is the 5th coldest city, which is not something we knew before we moved here. Coming from Miami and New Orleans, I think that would have daunted us.
Neither of you have been to Ames, Iowa, apparently. That's.
Is that the coldest?
Well, it is in my experience. I don't know about empirically. So 2007. Tell us a little bit about your growing up. You said you were born in Miami and you lived in England. You lived in West Virginia. How did
that
your
happen?
folks?
People usually ask, were they in the military? But they weren't. My father was from Key West. He's from the Cuban-American enclave in Key West that had been there since the 1860s, really. So his family had been there for a really long time, and he was the first one in his family to move so far north as to get to Miami, right? So he was the first one. And
He would be aghast at the weather here.
Oh, he would. He would be horrified. So he moved to Miami, and that's where I was born. And he was working for National Airlines. A lot of people don't remember National Airlines anymore. It merged with Pan Am, and then disappeared. But National used to run flights from, and Pan Am too, I think, ran flights from Key West to Cuba. And he moved to Miami and was working for National, and they asked him to go to London and open up the National Airlines station, the office, at Heathrow Airport.
How old were you at the time?
I was 2.
Oh, okay.
So, I didn't know what was going on, of course. And we had been living in an area of Miami called Opelika, and we moved to London, and we lived in an area called Weybridge. And he started working at Heathrow, and then we moved to a little town called Ascot, which is where the horse races were held. I didn't ever go to a horse race, but that's where we lived. Ascot, England. And we lived there for 4 years. I went to school there. I learned to read there. I learned to speak there, to really talk. And so when we came back, I had a very thick British accent. We moved back to Miami. And we were there for a couple of years, and then we moved to West Virginia. My father took a position with another airline, a very small commuter airline in West Virginia, and so we moved there, I think when I was 7 or 8, 7 I think, and then stayed in West Virginia until I moved away to go to college.
When did you, can you recall when you were smitten by the urge to do what you wound up doing? The writing part,
yeah.
or did you think about being a writer more than you thought about being an educator, or?
Yes and yes. I do remember being very small and writing little books on notepads around the house, illustrating them with little animals and writing little stories and then stapling them together. It was just kind of, for me, a natural outgrowth of looking at books. I was very lucky. My parents did read to me when I was small, and I learned to read early, and it just seemed natural. Like people who watch sports want to go play sports. Same kind of thing, maybe.
Or broadcast sports.
Right, or broadcast sports, exactly. Yeah, so it seemed entirely natural, and I've always been doing it, as a child at a very primitive kind of level. I don't remember ever playing teacher, but I always remember writing and illustrating little books. And then I just kept going, through grade school and high school, and it was just something I always did.
And you, I assume you studied that, or what'd you get your bachelor's and your PhD in?
I wanted to study political science at Trinity, so that's how I started.
That's the teacher part, maybe.
Well, that's the change the world part.
Yeah.
That's the idealistic part, and I became disillusioned very quickly.
Angry.
Oh,
disillusioned from in terms of
from
politics?
Yeah, I was super naive. And so I thought, well, I probably wouldn't be very good at that. And the only thing that I seemed to be very good at was my English studies. So that's what I did. And I was going to become I had my son when I was a junior at Trinity, so young. and I thought I would be a high school teacher. And I had I kind of knew the ropes for being a writer and how few writers can make a living at it in the United States. The estimate that I always hear now is about 400. About 400 writers in the United States actually make a living, and the rest of us have day jobs.
So you don't count yourself as prolific as you have been as a writer, as being successful because you also teach?
Well, I wouldn't, I wouldn't use the word successful to talk about it. I would just say, can people make a living?
Yeah.
Can they feed their families? Can they pay their bills?
I mean, do you come close with what you've done?
Some years.
Yeah.
Yeah. It varies, though. I mean, it's not. I do love the security of having a paycheck
Sure.
and insurance. I'm very grateful for those things.
So going back again, when did you begin writing seriously?
In graduate school. Okay, so to back up, I was going to become a high school teacher. I had a wonderful professor at Trinity who took me aside and said, you should try graduate school. And I didn't know what graduate school was at that point. I was a first-generation college student, and just really didn't understand how it all worked. I thought professors were a different species from the rest of us. And so that seemed dazzling to me, so I tried. I went to graduate school, and I did do a scholarly thesis and a scholarly dissertation, analyzing the works of, famous or canonical writers of literature. But I took creative writing classes on the side, and like as a little vice or a secret, because I just loved it so much.
At
Texas A&M.
At A&M.
Yeah, and so you turn in your manuscript, and the other students talk about it, and the professor talks about it. And I turned in my first manuscript, and I was very nervous, of course, and the professor said, you should send this out. This is wonderful. And I was shocked, and so I sent it out, and it got taken by a national journal, and so it was a happy day.
Had it not been for that success, maybe you wouldn't have
I would have just kept writing in my notebooks.
Yeah.
So that's where that started. So 1991 was when that first piece was published. I've been publishing for a long time, just little pieces until 2005 when my first book came out.
And we want to show our viewers your body of work, and we've got it from your website. You have done how many books now?
I've written 4 books that have been published, and then edited a 5th one that just came out last fall.
Yes, and different approaches, different genres, right?
Yes.
Explain.
Yeah. 2 of the books that I authored are memoir. The first book, the Truth book that came out in 2005, is about being adopted at birth in Miami by the Cuban-American family of Jehovah's Witnesses.
And that's this one?
Yes.
The Truth book.
Yeah. And growing up as a Jehovah's Witness, going door to door, knocking on people's doors early on Saturday morning and being received sometimes with a less than warm welcome by people who didn't want to be told about God's plan for them by a little girl. So I did that until I was 14 and ran away, and then left the religion at 15. So that book is about that experience, what that was like to grow up that way, from birth, and to be a true believer, and then to leave.
At what age did you leave?
I left home at 14 and left the religion at 15.
And didn't go back to it.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I told you, in the interest of being very candid and honest, I love to read, and I've not read any of your books. That one sounds fascinating. Maybe I'll start with that one.
Okay.
And not to let the cat out of the bag, but is the story in the end a positive experience or a negative experience, or share with us where you come down in the tone of this book regarding that.
Well, I love happy endings.
Good.
And I'm happy that my story has a happy ending. But the account itself is mixed. I mean, there were really positive things about that experience, and then there were some really negative things, and I try to look at them all in an even-handed way that records the beauty and the humor and the love that I knew, as well as the things that made me run away. So.
And I would guess that being Latina mixed with being Jehovah's Witness was an interesting mix for a unique experience. I mean, do you address that part?
I do.
Yeah.
It was. And I think that the Jehovah's Witnesses' commitment to racial equality is something that drew my family to it. Certainly my grandmother, who was the first convert in our family, and she was Cuban American living in Key West. And someone came to the door, knocked on the door, and it sounded good to her. She had been Catholic, and her children, my father had been an altar boy, and so on, and she converted and took all her children to the Kingdom Hall, and part of it had to do with racial justice and opportunity. So looking at that aspect of an unusual religion made the book an interesting project for me.
You alluded to positives and negatives in the experience. Can you share with us examples of both that give us a feel for your reality?
Sure. Well, that idea of racial justice and equality of opportunity was certainly a positive thing. Another commitment that Jehovah's Witnesses have is to a clean earth, a beautiful clean earth. So I don't know if now they refer to themselves as environmentalists or not, but I grew up with an environmentalist's ethic, whether we called it that around the house or not. Certainly the earth was something to be treasured and prized and cared for and so on. So, those are things that I'm grateful for and that I value. In my experience, it was a very hierarchical religion, very patriarchal as well. Women were not quite to be seen and not heard, but close to that. And even as a little kid, I think I was just a little bit mouthier than that, or at least, if not a rebellious kid, if not a mouthy kid, I certainly liked asking questions, and I wanted real answers, not simply to be told, "We'll take it on faith," or you can't because you're a girl. That didn't make sense to me even as a child. So things like that were things that I chafed against. And then my particular family turned abusive in multiple ways, and that's what caused me to run away.
Abusive as it relates to the religion?
Well, the man that my mother married after my parents divorced he was a devout Jehovah's Witness, and he used the religion as a rationale for some of the abuse that he enacted, domestic violence and so on. Certainly the religion itself is not to blame for that. People in all religions can use the principles of their religions for violent ends.
And do.
Exactly, and do. Yeah, so that's what he did. I don't think I would have run away if we hadn't been being abused. I probably would have continued chafing and asking questions, but not run away. But I did run away, and that led to a pretty significant break and a pretty significant reevaluation. We got my brother out with my testimony. The police got him out. So it was quite dramatic, and it really did lead me as a very young person to energetically reevaluate all that I'd been taught in a way that I might not have if it had been a peaceful or encouraging or nurturing home all the way.
How common is that an occurrence in the religion?
Oh, that's a really interesting question, and a sociologist of religion would be better suited to answer it. Certainly, I receive a lot of emails from people who have left the Jehovah's Witnesses and have read my book and reach out. So I think it's a pretty common story, but I don't know statistics on that.
Yeah.
I do know that I've heard from therapists around the country who work primarily with people who've left Jehovah's Witnesses or other Christian sects that are very fundamentalist, and they say that they really struggle because the Jehovah's Witnesses, at least, are so socially immersive. You go to school, you go to work, but your whole social life consists of other Jehovah's Witnesses. Those are who you're supposed to socialize with, and everyone else is called worldly. So you don't have social ties outside the religion. If you leave the religion and are shunned, then you're really on your own socially, and so that's a pretty drastic kind of experience for people to go through.
Not that I'm labeling, but the word cult comes to mind here based on what you just said.
It's not technically a cult. I did a lot of research after I wrote the Truth Book. I wanted the Truth Book to be primarily about my own experience, but then I wanted to be able to talk about the religion relatively knowledgeably from an objective point of view. So it's not a cult. There are some characteristics of cults that Jehovah's Witnesses do not have, and they are Christian, so they're sort of an offshoot of more traditional Christianity. So they're referred to technically as a sect. But yeah, they're in terms of the immersive, the social nature of it, they have some things perhaps in common with some cults, but they're not a cult technically.
And what makes it not a cult?
Yeah, you know what? I don't remember the actual
distinction there?
Yeah, the actual characteristics, but
that's all right. Why
yeah.
do you suppose that so many major religions tend to be hierarchical and at the same time patriarchal?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I would, not being an expert in that field, I would guess that it's because religions grow out of cultures, and at the time that those religions grew up, the cultures were largely hierarchical and patriarchal.
Male-dominated.
Yeah, sure. Power tends to, unless we work vigorously in the opposite direction, power tends to form in a triangle, whether you're talking about socioeconomic power or racial power, or, there are usually people at the top.
Someone at the top,
Someone
fewer
at
of them than at the
yeah,
bottom.
Yeah. So that's what I would say. That's my non-sociologist answer to that question.
Let me, I want to talk about all of your books, and I hope we've given folks a feel for this initial, the initial one here. But I don't want the hour to go by without us talking about what was your presentation? What did you tell the audience here when you were at Metro? What was your message?
Yeah. Well, the book Island of Bones, which came out in 2012, is a kind of follow-up to the Truth Book. I didn't think I would write another memoir, but I started writing short pieces, and I thought, well, maybe these pieces together add up to something that's like a book, and it's 20 short essays. And a lot of them are about Latino identity.
Mm-hmm.
And
This is your website.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So a lot of the essays in that book, not all, but a lot of them are about Latino identity. And so that's why I think Barbara Velasquez invited me to speak with her students at MCC. And we were talking about the nuances and the complexities of Latino identity in the U.S. It's complicated. People don't all come from one country. Everyone who comes here has a different set of political background, cultural background, and economic background. Cubans have often been seen as a very privileged immigrant group, and have been. That's correct. After Castro's revolution, so the Cubans that came in 1959, 1960, 1962, those early waves of Cubans were welcomed in a way that many other Latino immigrants have not been welcomed.
Because they had money.
Well, because they had money, and because it was sort of an anti-communist statement
Mm-hmm.
to welcome them with open arms and to make sure that they had opportunities available to them. Now, Cubans that have come since 1980 and the children of earlier Cubans have not had as gracious an experience necessarily. And so what I was talking about was that small enclave on Key West that had been there since the 1860s, 1870s, that has largely been erased in the public imagination, the historical imagination, because of the waves of Cuban immigrants that came after Castro's revolution. Most people don't know that there were Cubans in New York City, Cubans in Key West, Cubans in Tampa, decades and decades before Castro. So I was talking about that and how there are different kinds of histories, and it's interesting and maybe even important to become aware of how much diversity there is within diversity.
Mm-hmm.
So we were talking about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the It's that way with every
immigrant group,
immigrant and minority group. You
or
look
not
at
immigrant.
you look at someone and you immediately put them in a category that isn't necessarily valid.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's so much that mainstream media or mainstream education doesn't necessarily teach us about different ethnic minority groups, whether they're immigrant or not.
So did you have a bottom line to your message to the students that you spoke to as far as all that is concerned, or
A
just-
bottom line, no. I was
Okay.
just sort of sharing my
Okay.
experience, reading a little bit, asking them questions. Yeah.
But you said it's difficult to be Latino or Latina in terms of people not understanding the diversity of culture that everyone comes from, or the diversity of whatever. What makes that difficult?
Well, there are different kinds of difficulties for Latinos now. One huge political issue around which many of us have coalesced is the issue of immigration, documentation, opportunities for people who came here without papers, and for their children and so on. So that's one issue, but it's not the only issue. And sometimes Latinos are viewed by non-Latinos as all being illegal immigrants, as people say in the phrase that's losing currency now.
Yeah, it's undocumented.
Right,
Mhm.
undocumented. So that's one thing. There are racial expectations about Latinos. Latinos, of course, span the sort of racial spectrum from very fair-skinned blondes to people with almost entirely African blood. So there's this mestizo or mixed nature of Latinos. And when you come to America, often you're classified as black or white. So that's kind of interesting too.
What do you mean expectations in that regard?
For example, so to be more personal and maybe more interesting, like I've had people say, oh, you can't be Latino, you don't look Latino, or you don't have a Mexican accent, or something, things like that. So
Yeah.
there are expectations about how you'll perform Latinidad, whether physically or in terms of your manner or,
Mm-hmm.
your voice.
And isn't that interesting? Because
Yeah.
if you're Caucasian, you can be all over the board in terms of your skin complexion, and yet those expectations aren't as, I don't know.
Maybe rigid?
Yeah, as rigid, yeah.
Because there's not the expectation that you, as a member of a minority, are representing your whole minority group, right?
Right,
Yeah.
I
So
guess.
yeah,
I don't know.
I
It's
don't
just
know.
interesting.
It is interesting.
So we jumped from 2005 to 2012 with those two.
Yes.
Let's talk about the rest of your books. I'll let
Okay.
you kind of, because again, time goes by very fast
Oh,
here.
sure. Okay.
So, is that the last one that you wrote, or what?
So before Island of Bones came out in
Uh-huh.
2012, I had another book that came out in 2012 that I'd been working on for several years. It's called Hell or High Water, and it's a literary thriller, a mystery, suspense novel. It's set in New Orleans, and I wrote it because, you
Katrina?
can't. Well, yes, it has to do with Katrina. I wrote it because you can't endlessly write memoir. I know a few writers who do that, but I do not have that exciting life. So I have always loved.
You're done?
I don't know if I'm done, but I'm going to have to live a few more years. So I have always loved the mystery genre. Always read those from when I was a small child and loved them. And I thought that would be really interesting to write a novel that is a mystery. And so the protagonist is a journalist working at the Times-Picayune in New Orleans after Katrina, 3 years after Katrina. She's Cuban American and she's young, so that I kind of slipped that part in to keep it a bit personal. And she's from a background of poverty, which is also something that I know about. So she has some personal characteristics, but she's not based on me. And the story grew from a real story after Katrina.
Where did you find the real story?
In the New York Times. My husband is from New Orleans, and his parents, during Katrina, they evacuated and they came to stay with us, so we were all This was when we were living in Indiana, so we were all following the news quite obsessively. And my husband pointed this story out to me, thinking I would be interested, and he was right. During the mandatory evacuation, hundreds and hundreds of registered sex offenders went off the grid. And by 2008, April 2008, when my fictional novel is set, about 1,800 of them had never been relocated.
And that is
That's a fact.
Yeah.
That's a fact.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what got me writing. I thought that is fascinating. Where did they go? What did they do? And what would happen if you had a cub reporter, a young female cub reporter assigned to that story? She could get into some really perilous situations.
Boy.
Yeah. So that's the novel that I wrote.
Wow.
Yeah. I thought it would be interesting, and it was interesting.
Is there a huge payoff at the end?
Readers say so. Yeah, so it does have an ending that people really like.
I asked you before we went on, before we started taping, what should I read first, and now I want to read that one first.
Oh, good. Yeah. Well, there's a lot of New Orleans social history in it too, which was a lot of fun to work with. I'm a research addict, as a professor. I could spend my life in an archive. And so working that into a mystery novel without slowing it down was a challenge for me.
Do you ever read any James Lee Burke?
Oh yeah, I like James Lee Burke a lot.
New
Yeah.
Orleans
Oh, definitely.
Yeah,
Admirer.
it's just great.
Yeah.
Okay. So has this got that feel, kind of?
I think it has its own kind of feel, and I don't people, when you look on Amazon and you see who's buying the books that. Wait a minute. Like if you look and see someone who bought this book also bought.
Yes.
Yeah, that. So people who buy my book also buy James Lee Burke a lot.
Yeah.
So
Well, that just went to the top of the list.
Yeah, thank you. And then the sequel came out last year in 2013, and it's the same protagonist. It's called Nearer Home, and she's still in New Orleans. Different crimes, police brutality and political corruption. So she's investigating those.
She's a survivor, apparently.
Yep. Yeah.
Morning Call. So is that 4 of the 5 that you published we've talked about?
Yes, yeah, we have. So that one was a lot of fun too. The mysteries have been optioned for film or television. The first one has appeared in Germany and will come out in France, I think in 2015.
For this book? Or all of them?
The first book has come out in Germany, and both books will come out in French.
Well, see, now when that happens, then you can quit.
Oh, I'm not looking to quit.
Then you won't have to have a paycheck. I mean, there could be a big payday, right? Hopefully.
Well, that happens for some writers, but I do like to teach. I like to be in the classroom, and I really like having colleagues. So.
So where do you find the time to do all this? I mean, I just find it fascinating. I mean, I think everybody who likes reading thinks, "Gosh, I wish I could be a writer," you know. And I just think it probably takes a superior person to be able to do that.
Well, I hope that you'll continue to propagate that myth, because we love being thought of as superior. No.
You're supposed to disabuse me and say, "Oh no, you should try it, and here's what to do." I mean, that's my next question.
I will. We're not superior
How
at
do
all.
you do it?
So one thing is that I didn't publish a book-length work until my son was a teenager. When he was small, I only published very short things because they were what I was capable of comprehending, as a full piece, writing them and then revising them. So I wrote and published short essays, short stories.
Magazines?
Right, in journals
Yeah.
and magazines. And then as he grew older, it became a little bit easier. Also, I think structurally it helped me to move to UNL because it is a Research 1 institution, and the teaching load is a lighter teaching load than I had at the small college where I was teaching before. So that was like a 3-3 load, 3 in the fall, 3 in the spring, lots of service, etc. And my teaching load at UNL is a lighter load, and so that gives you more time. But mostly I draft in the summers is the secret. And that's something that people who teach have the luxury of it being able to do, having that 3-month, or in some cases more like 2-month span in the summers where you can really live like an artist, live like a writer. And so that's where I produce a draft, and then during the school year, I can revise it. It's really hard for me to produce something full length that's fresh and new during the school year because my brain is just too occupied with teaching.
And do you find that you need to do it in a shorter period of time? You can't produce something that you feel good about if it takes you through past those summer months and into the winter and then on to the next cycle?
You know, so far, I haven't had to try. I've been able to finish within, maybe that could work for me. Maybe it works for other writers, surely. But I've always been able to get at least a really rough draft hacked out during the summers.
So what's the routine? You have an office at home, I assume, right?
No.
Where do you write?
No, that's funny. The Virginia Woolf idea of a room of one's own is something that writers talk about all the time, and
You do it at the kitchen table?
I have done a lot of writing at the kitchen table, and now this is going to sound very decadent, but I wake up in the morning and write in bed before I get up.
On your iPad?
Nope, I write by hand.
You do?
All the books I've written by hand in notebooks. I write better. My sentences are better. When I type sentences, they are not as well crafted from the get-go for me.
That is.
I don't know. I think that having to write them more slowly gives me the opportunity to try out 2 or 3 endings in my head before I get it down. Whereas if I'm typing, I can grab the first one, so they're not as tested.
So is there a typical? Because I think the thing that probably dissuades anybody that's a non-writer from even trying, because I write 30-second commercials. I write 60-second commercials. I write scripts for television shows. I write, scripts for broadcast opens, and I know how long it takes me to create that.
Yeah.
Is there a you get up in the morning and you grab your notebook and your pencil. Is it a pencil or a pen?
It's a pen.
A pen, and you come up with 3 pages of your next book. How long does it take you to do that?
The 3 pages?
Yeah.
I don't track it. Since it's the summer, I don't have anybody waiting for me, so usually a couple hours. I usually write about 20 to 30 pages a day, handwriting, so they're not huge pages. But
20 to 30 pages in a day.
Right. And it takes me a couple hours, and then I'll get up and act like a normal person.
So it only takes you a couple hours to write 20 or 30 pages.
I'm not saying they're great pages, right? But they come fast, and so when it's going well, it's like taking dictation.
Yeah.
And then when you go back to type them up and start revising, that's for me when I get critical.
Yeah.
So
you don't worry about getting it perfect initially.
No. Well, you're kind of in the back of your mind always worried about getting it perfect, and you're always going to fail. Even at the last revision, you're not going to have it perfect, so you just try.
But you wouldn't have succeeded if you hadn't figured that out, right?
Right.
That you can do those 20 or 30 pages.
Yeah, I would have stifled myself.
And clean them up later.
Right. Yeah, I would have stifled myself definitely if I'd expected
Do most writers do it that way, or do you know?
Most of the writers that I've talked to definitely have a process of drafting something sloppy and imperfect and then revising, usually multiple times. So
it's fascinating.
Yeah.
So what do you outside the classroom? What do you say to the wannabe writer who feels like, I just think I've got some really important things to contribute to the world that it could only be done on paper. So how do I do it?
Well,
what do you do?
You read a lot.
Yeah.
And you set aside some time. And a lot of people write for 15 minutes a day, maybe first thing in the morning, or maybe the last thing before they go to bed, or maybe on their lunch hour. If you write a page a day.
But do you need to know where you're going?
Sometimes people do. need to know where they're going. Sometimes they do know where they're going and they write a beautiful outline and they follow that outline. Sometimes not. Sometimes you have to write to figure out where you're going. One of my favorite writers of all time is E.M. Forster, the British writer who wrote A Room with a View. And he said, how can I know what I think until I see what I say? Right? So I have to write it out to figure out what the heck it is that I really think and feel. And maybe it doesn't even come out in that first draft, but you get like an inkling or a hunch and you're like, okay, I'm on to something. In this draft, it's not quite true yet. So I'm going to write another draft and go deeper, and another draft and be more honest. So.
What does your husband do?
My husband is a technical writer. We met in graduate school. He was working on a thesis about Chaucer, so medieval literature. And he decided that he didn't want to become an academic, and he became a technical writer. He works for a software company in Texas. Yeah, he telecommutes, so he lives, he works from home in Lincoln.
Can you even relate to that kind of writing?
I taught technical writing in graduate school for a little while.
It just sounds so, I don't know, boring or
I don't find it exciting.
yeah.
I don't think I would wake up and do it right in bed, technical writing for 2 hours every morning. But
It pays.
well, it's practical, and I really value the clarity of it. If you
Sure.
take a 10-page document and reduce it to 5 bullet points, that is an extremely helpful exercise, and I think some writers can be helped by that kind of leanness and efficiency. Yeah, you have to be really critical.
I don't want to dominate this conversation.
That's fine. It's fun.
Have we talked about all the books yet?
The book that I edited that came out last fall, we haven't talked about.
Yeah. It's called
It's called Family Trouble.
Family Trouble.
Yeah, and it grew out of touring with the Truth Book, that very personal book of memoir. Right, yes. As I was touring, everywhere I went, people would ask from the audience, and this didn't matter if it was an academic audience or a bookstore audience or a library audience, people would say, when that book came out, what did your mother say? Right?
Oh, this is the one where you had your little brother
Yes.
look the whole thing over because you were more concerned about him
Right.
than anybody in the family,
yeah.
right?
Yep.
And he okayed it all?
He did. He
Yeah.
okayed it all.
What did you say?
Well, what fascinated me was the fact that there was so much energy around that question. That so many people in different places and in different settings would want to know, well, what does your family say when you reveal that kind of material? And I thought, if I get that question, I bet a lot of memoirists get that question. So I invited some really wonderful, distinguished memoirists to write about it, and they wrote essays on that topic for this book, and I did the editing and collected them, and it's 25 essays from 25 different memoirists about the costs of revealing private family material and the rewards. How did their families become better families? In some cases, families talk more than they did before the memoir came out, or they're more honest. In some cases, family members hung up, and I don't want to talk to you. I can't believe you did this.
Forever? In some cases?
In one case in the book, 6 years. 6 years, someone did not talk to her child because of the child's having written about the family issues. So sometimes there are severe costs, and sometimes there are tremendous gains. And the writers also talk about their strategies. Who did they show the manuscript to before it went to press? Who did they not show the manuscript to before it went to press?
Probably the ones that are not talking to them.
Yeah, probably so. And how did they make those choices? What were their cost-benefit analyses to get tech writery about it? How did they make those calculations and those decisions, and what worked and what didn't work? I mean, there are writers who talk really frankly about some of their regrets in that book. And so I think it's a passionate book. It's a really beautiful book. I mean, they're all wonderful writers to begin with. So these essays are really lovely, honest, searching kinds of craft essays about how they do what they do. And the decisions that they've had to make.
I'm guessing that one of the themes in common with familial issues after doing one of these is revealing abuse.
Some reveal abuse. Sometimes that's not the case. In the case of Paul Lisiecki's lovely essay in the book, he wrote about his aunt in a very positive way, but it was just an anecdote. And when she read the book, she was upset because she only formed a small part rather than a larger part. Right? She was a minor character instead of a starring role in his book, and that felt painful to her. You know,
Yeah.
the way we think about ourselves is not always the way we're
Yeah.
perceived, and we can't control that.
Deflating somebody's ego.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
So, and sometimes.
I never liked you, Mother.
Right. You're like, oh, but I tried to be a good mother. So, yeah, no, it's very fraught, and I think anybody who's seen things about themselves in print knows that it can be painful and difficult, that it doesn't always match up with your self-concept. And so when memoirists do that, they're taking on a real nest of issues.
I know a little bit about that on a whole different, in a different arena entirely, but you know, when you do something publicly for a career,
Oh, sure.
and you marry the reality that for the last 15, 20 years now, people online can say anything
Comment.
about anybody
Right.
and anonymously.
Which
you
frees them up to be as
really
blunt as they
mean,
want, right?
Yeah, and to say things that they would never say if they signed their name to it.
Right. Yeah.
Pretty soon you don't go to those sites.
Right. Don't read the comments.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, in your family's case, were you afraid that of the repercussions with what you wrote about them?
To some extent, sure. I was already fairly estranged from the mother who had raised me and who had remained a Jehovah's Witness. And when I let her know about the book, she simply said, I can't deal with you. And she hasn't. She hasn't dealt with me since then in any way, which is sad to me because I think that one of the things that happens when you write memoir is that one of the things that can happen, I don't know that it always happens, but you become more compassionate. When you really look at the full story, the full situation, you go, wow, look at all these factors that this person was dealing with,
Contributed to
coping
their
with.
behavior, yeah.
Right. You have a more compassionate take on it, a more forgiving take on it. If it included things like abuse, you go, okay, I can see why.
Yep.
You know, I can't say it was okay, but
No.
I can certainly see why and see the pain that person was suffering. So naively, I had hoped that it could lead to some kind of rapprochement, but that didn't happen.
Yeah.
Understandably.
A very wise person once told me, we always do the best that we know how to do.
Yes.
And that doesn't mitigate pain that you cause other people in
Right,
your lifetime, but it explains it.
Yeah, the best that you know how to do might really suck.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
But it's still, you were doing your best. So, yeah.
The genre, the narrative, there's a term called creative nonfiction.
Right, yeah.
Isn't that an oxymoron?
Well, it sounds like it, because nonfiction, the term nonfiction presumes a fidelity to the facts as they can be known. And I think
And then you can't take creativity with that.
you
Then.
can't take creative license. You can't invent things. I think the reason people say creative nonfiction is that some of the strategies that writers in that genre use are the strategies of fiction or poetry. Like, for example, instead of writing everything in a tidy, linear fashion, maybe they jump around in time, right?
Mhm.
The way a novel might, with flashbacks and flash forwards. Or maybe they describe things, real things, in beautiful lyrical language, right? Or maybe they have a jump cut between a scene of dialogue and something that's more summary, descriptive. And also, sometimes some writers will take liberties with dialogue. You say, how can you remember a conversation that happened 20 years ago? And a sort of norm within the genre of creative nonfiction is that these are reconstructed conversations based on what one remembers of the voice in the moment. And you just have to say, okay, memory is fallible, and yes, this is definitely told from a subjective point of view, one person's point of view, but that there's an attempt to recreate things in a way that's faithful to what really happened. So.
I know you have said that in terms of recreating those conversations, that you have a way of doing that where you remember something that somebody was wearing, the tie or something. Wasn't that you?
Oh.
And you focus on just remembering that, and it brings it back to you.
Sometimes, yeah. You might remember a particular characteristic phrase. Maybe it's something your mother said over and over, so you know that she said that thing. And then you're like, okay, well...
You're going to go blind.
Okay, well, that's candid of you. Whatever it was, and that's her voice. Here's what she would have said in this situation. You remember maybe a couple of fragments. In my case with the tie, that if you're referring to it, I think you're referring to. I remember that my stepfather had this particular kind of tie, and one night I just sat up in bed, and it was like all these memories were just sort of flooding back, and I could. It was like an auditory hallucination. I could hear his voice. I could hear the things that he was saying, and write it down.
Wow.
So yeah. But I try to be very sparing with dialogue in memoir because of that difficulty around it. It's problematic. It's epistemologically problematic. You can't empirically prove that was said unless you were running around with a wire as an 8-year-old or whatever. So I try to keep it to the bare minimum, just where it's necessary and where I can feel pretty secure that that's what the conversation was.
Well, that's where, another genre, I don't know if it exists, or you can certainly tell me if it does or it doesn't, but why can't you fictionalize the account into a novel?
Definitely.
Make yourself someone else like Willa Cather used to do.
Absolutely. Autobiographical novels are, they are a genre, and some of the, I think some of the most wonderful works of 20th century literature are autobiographical fiction. Hemingway, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, and that's the area I studied as a PhD student. I love that work. So yeah, we could do that now. I think there's a kind of socio-political weight that comes from staking a truth claim in the genre of memoir, to say, yes, this really did happen. It happened to these people, it happened at this time. There's a kind of investment that readers bring to a text when they believe or know or have been told that it is true. And sometimes I think that's a valuable thing.
I think people should explore narratives because too many, and I'm guilty of this, categorize themselves as a reader. Their interest is only in nonfiction or fiction. And so this is kind of in between, isn't it?
Well,
the narrative?
I think most memoirists would say, well, it's definitely nonfiction.
Memoir, yeah.
Yeah.
And yet it reads like fiction.
Well, if it's good. Well, and some of the best nonfiction that's not memoir really does read like fiction, reads like a novel, right?
Yeah.
Really good journalism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's hard,
History. It is hard. It's really hard.
It can be hard to read nonfiction.
Hard to write. Yeah, to take a welter of facts and make them into a compelling story.
What's next for you? I mean, what are you doing now, writing-wise?
Well, I just finished a book of short stories that'll be out in 2015. It's called How Winter Began. And I'm excited about those. And I'll probably be doing some revisions on the manuscript. But what I'm really excited about working on freshly right now is a novel. It's a new novel, and I'm about 300 pages into it. It's called The Strain. That's a working title. Usually your publisher changes your title anyway, but and it's set in Chicago and in West Virginia, where I lived for a while, as I was mentioning. And it's about a YA author, so somebody who writes books for young adults, and she's in a situation with a lot of strain. She's about to turn 40. Her husband wants a family, and unbeknownst to him, she's the surviving child of a maternal filicide. So when a mother kills a child, so her mother has murdered her sibling and has gone to prison, convicted and gone to prison.
He doesn't know this?
And her husband doesn't know about this, and it's this sort of secret history that she hasn't revealed to people. She doesn't want to be seen as that, that freaky survivor.
And is this why she doesn't want children?
Well, she doesn't trust herself. If her mother did this thing, does she carry like a strain of that kind of
genetic
impulse?
predisposition?
Right, which is kind of absurd, but she's worried about it, and so she's working through this odd situation by writing YA fiction, and so there are chapters that are sort of realistic in her life at the moment, and then
Come out in her work.
and then it comes out in the YA chapters as
Where
well.
do
So it
you?
goes back and
Where
forth.
does all this? Now, in this case, did it all come together before you started?
Some of it has been emerging as I've been writing. One of the things that troubled me as a teenager in West Virginia was the prevalence of strip mining. And now it's only become more intensive with mountaintop removal mining. And we've just seen nationally the terrible story of the chemical spill in the Elk River and what it did to hundreds of thousands of West Virginians. So it's become, the novel that I'm working on has become more environmentally concerned. It started with a personal story, and now it's sort of broadening into a political story, which keeps happening with all my work, so
Yeah.
I shouldn't be surprised.
No, and I have been remiss because you characterize yourself as being about politics to a degree, and we haven't even talked about that. So
That's okay.
in 2 minutes, 1 minute, where are you coming from politically?
Oh,
Because we've only got 1 minute left.
sure, okay. Well, I love justice. I love justice for everyone, and so sometimes my concerns have led me towards racial justice, economic justice, gender justice, justice for survivors of violence, for veterans, and environmental justice, which I think is an issue for all of us now.
Are we getting there, or are we going away from getting further away from justice, or getting closer to justice?
Well, I'm just going to say 2 steps forward, 1 step back, because
Good.
I'm an optimist.
There you go. Glass is half full.
Yeah.
So we can find your books online
Yeah.
at first of all, your website, joycastro.com, right?
Yeah.
And then you're on Amazon, and
Or your local independent bookstore can order them for you.
yeah, great.
Always pleasure.
This has been fun. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. This
Yeah.
was a nice conversation.
Thanks for being with us today, and for your appearance at Metro, Dr. Joy Castro. And thank you for being with us again on Metro and More. Our goal is to better acquaint you with the mission, leadership, and the reach of the college. For Metropolitan Community College, I'm Kent Pavelka.
This has been a Metrovision production produced by Metropolitan Community College.
After high school, I became a father and had to put college on hold. I never had a chance to do what I really wanted. Now at 35, I'm moving forward with a career in media arts. MCC makes it convenient and comfortable, plus the facilities are outstanding. They were very accepting of me coming back.
On average, every hour of credit increases the income of an MCC student by $159 per year. The inspiring option is Metropolitan Community College.